finding out what I have to say. So can you see my slides? Okay, good. So I spent about 15 years of my life studying causal reasoning. And because I was asked so kindly to give this talk, I thought about how that work connected to my current work. And I've decided that I've continued to study causal reasoning, although in a very different vein. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an historical perspective that I think is revealing about what people are good and not so good at and what machines are capable of. So when I think about reasoning, when I think about thinking in general, in fact, I think about it as an extension of action, right? So all organisms act in the world. That's how they come to evolve. And thinking is a really, really useful way to extend the ability to act effectively in the world. And indeed, when you think about things we reason about, they're generally directly connected to action, right? So when we cook, we both reason about what we're putting together, about the ingredients and how they merge, and we're also physically operating on the world. And the kind of reasoning that is most useful for thinking about what the effects of actions will be is causal reasoning, right? Because actions are causes and the outcomes we're looking for are effects. So I think of causal reasoning as the infrastructure of thought in this sense. But not only is causal reasoning the infrastructure of thought, I think it's also the infrastructure of discourse, right? It serves as the glue that allows us to converse with one another. And indeed, if you look at language, you see causality all over the place. A huge proportion of the verbs we use, for instance, are causal verbs, in that they describe changes of state as a result of some kind of intervention or manipulation. So cognitive scientists have been thinking about causal reasoning. Many cognitive scientists have been thinking about causal reasoning in a particular way for over 20 years now, since the work of Judea Pearl and some other philosophers and computer scientists who developed a formal system for describing how we make causal inferences. So let me just give you a very superficial taste of that formal system, because it'll serve as a ground for what we talk about when we talk about causal reasoning. So the system is called Causal Bayes Nets, and I think the best way to think about it is as a representation in three parts. So on one hand, we have the world that we're trying to represent. Can you see my cursor here when I move it? Yes. Yeah. So, let's say we're trying to represent this chicken and egg problem, right? So there's this causal system in the world, right? And we have two formal representations of this causal system. On one hand, we have a causal model, which is a graph that takes the variables that we use to describe this causal system. So I've just chosen three variables here. Obviously, there are a lot more involved in this particular system, and in general, there are dozens or hundreds or maybe even thousands of variables relevant when we're representing the world. But for simplicity's sake, I've just chosen three. So one thing we know about this system is that this chicken has some DNA, which I'll call A, and that DNA causes it to have feathers. It's not, of course, the only thing that causes it to have feathers, but there is a causal relation from having DNA to having feathers, and also from having DNA to producing eggs. Okay, so that's a causal model, a graphical representation of this causal system. There's also a probability model, right? So the probability model we can think of as the probability of these three variables together, the probability of A, B, and C, and that's going to be equal to some relation amongst the individual probabilities. So I'm not going to go into the relation in any depth. Let me just say that the causal model can be thought of as a representation of the probability model. So the reason I've structured, the equation in this particular way is because it's respecting the relations among these three variables as represented in this graph. So there's no direct relation between B and C, and hence there's no probability that relates B and C directly in this equation. So when we think about these kinds of Bayes Nets representations, we should be thinking about three representations simultaneously. One is the representation of the world by the causal model. Another is the representation of the world by the probability model. And then the third, and this is the thing that really excites computer scientists, is the representation of the probability model by the causal model. And it excites computer scientists because it allows them to simplify their calculations in a big way. Okay, so that's a key property of causal Bayes nets. And one implication of this kind of representation is what we can call screening off. Sometimes it's referred to as the Markov property of Bayesian representations. And so let me introduce it to you by example. Consider the following two causal relations. First, smoking more than 3 packs of cigarettes a day often causes impairment of lung function. Second, smoking more than 3 packs of cigarettes a day often causes damage to blood vessels. Okay, hopefully you believe those are plausible causal relations, and we can represent them this way as what's called a common cause model. Now, what causal Bayes nets tell us is that if you're interested in knowing the probability that someone has bad blood vessels, given that they smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, right? So in the world in which we smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, what's the probability of having bad blood vessels? That should be the same as the probability of having bad blood vessels given that someone smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day and they have bad lung function. In other words, the idea is that, I've lost my cursor here, there it is. The idea is that once you know how much someone smokes, if you're interested in this variable is irrelevant. Lung function is irrelevant because it is screened off by the amount smoked. That's an implication of this kind of representation. However, it turns out that people don't respect that relation. In fact, people think if you tell them that somebody has bad lung function, then they think the probability of having bad blood vessels is actually higher, even if they know the amount smoked. In other words, people violate this screening off or Markov property in their judgments of probability. So my student, Jua Park, addressed this in the following way. He said, well, there may be 2 reasons that are kind of consistent with the general causal Bayes net approach that would explain this. What we give people is this cover story of 2 causal relations, but people may read more into it than that. And they may say, well, actually, there's an underlying mechanism that's driving this relation, right? So for instance, the amount you smoke may produce tar in your lungs or in your cardiovascular system, and that might be the cause of the state of your lungs and your blood vessels. So I'm going to call that the mediating mechanism hypothesis. There's another hypothesis, the contradiction hypothesis, which says what people do is they think about other variables that are related to the two that you've mentioned. So the amount smoked is obviously not the only determinant of your lung function and the state of your blood vessels. Other factors, D, like how much you exercise, may also be relevant. And so it could be that people import beliefs about variable M or variable D when they're making these kinds of judgments. And this, I think, is a perfectly reasonable way to explain Markov violations, right? In the sense that if you think there is this mediating relation, then it's no longer the case that A is should screen off L from B. And if you think that D exists, then again, if you learn that someone has bad lung function, that does inform you about their blood vessels by virtue of this other mediating variable D. But consider the case where mechanisms are different. So in this example, we have the first statement, same as the last: smoking more than 3 packs of cigarettes a day often causes impairment of lung function. But the second one is different. Smoking more than 3 packs of cigarettes a day often causes a financial burden on the family budget. So we have a similar cover story, at least the structure of the cover story is the same, but the mediating mechanism hypothesis would be different because it states that because it's necessarily the case that there are different mechanisms mediating the impairment of lung function and the financial burden on the family budget, right? They're just different kinds of variables, and the relation between the amount that one smokes and these effects has got to be different. One is mediated by, say, the amount of tar, another is mediated by the cost of the cigarettes. And similarly, even if you think that this is the right structure, we again have different mechanisms at play. If something disables, say, the relation between the amount one smokes and lung function, that's going to be a different disabler than the thing that disables the relation between the amount one smokes and the financial burden. So according to this hypothesis, if people are using causal Bayes nets to make their inferences, they're just adding variables, they're interpreting the structure differently, then screening off should hold when the mechanisms are different. And that's exactly what Jua found in a long series of experiments, actually. So when the mechanisms are the same, we find this violation of the screening off property, telling them that the second effect is not true, reduces the probability of the first effect. But when the mechanisms are different, then people respond differently. So people are importing all kinds of knowledge into their representations. And in other work, Jua actually found evidence that's more consistent with the contradiction hypothesis than the mediating mechanism hypothesis, but that may have to do with the specifics of the causal systems that he was investigating. So it looks like screening off does hold, but not with respect to the experimenter's causal models, rather with respect to participants or subjects' causal models. We have to think not only about relations of probability, but the specifics of mechanisms. And as those of you who study causal reasoning know, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the specifics of mechanisms matter a lot. For instance, I'm a great admirer of Uk-Young Ahn and Jeremy Bailenson work, showing that when people have to explain something, they would much prefer a causal explanation or something that refers to a specific mechanism than a mere probabilistic relation. Probability relations don't generally stand up in court. They don't motivate judges or juries the way that mechanistic relations do. Okay, so that's some evidence that we should take this causal Bayes net formulation seriously. It's at least one prediction that it gets right. Here's something that it doesn't do so well on. So consider this this case that I studied with Phil Fernbach and Adam Darlow. So in the causal case, I'll sometimes refer to it as the predictive case. We're thinking from cause to effect in this situation. We have Ms. Y, who's a 32-year-old female who's been diagnosed with depression. Please indicate the likelihood that she presents with lethargy. Okay, so being depressed is the cause, presenting with lethargy is the effect. Or we could reverse that and ask this diagnostic question. So Ms. Y is a 32-year-old female who presented with lethargy. Please indicate the likelihood that she's been diagnosed with depression, right? It's diagnostic because we're saying what's the probability of the cause given the effect. We can ask a similar question, but say, I don't want you to think about alternative causes, right? There are no alternative causes of lethargy. So in particular here, we say Ms. Y is a 32-year-old female who's been diagnosed with depression. A complete diagnostic workup reveals that she's not been diagnosed with any other medical or psychiatric disorder that would cause lethargy. Please indicate the likelihood that she presents with lethargy. And similarly, in the diagnostic case, it's the same as the diagnostic question before, but we say there are no alternative causes. So here's the situation. We're asking in the first case, what's the probability of lethargy given depression? And in the second case, we're asking what's the probability of lethargy given depression, and there's no alternative cause. There's no stress or dehydration or anything else that might cause lethargy. So presumably, learning that there's no alternative cause should reduce the probability of lethargy, right? Because there's less reason to expect it. In the diagnostic case, however, we're asking what's the probability of depression given lethargy, either with an alternative cause or without an alternative cause. And if we tell people there's no alternative cause, then presumably the probability of depression is, it might even be 1 or at least very close to 1, right? Because we know the person presents with lethargy and we're told there's no alternative cause. So the probability, so depression is the only available explanation. In other words, telling people there's no alternative cause should reduce the probability in the causal or predictive direction, but it should increase the probability judgment in the diagnostic direction. So I've just written that down here. That's another way to think about the prediction of the Causal Bayes net view. And here are the results. And what we see is that in the diagnostic case, people's judgments are just fine. When we say there's no alternative cause, their judgment is much higher than when there is an alternative cause. It's not 1, but there are all kinds of reasons people might not use an extreme value on the response scale. It's certainly higher than in the case where there is an alternative cause. But when people are making causal or predictive judgments, there's actually no difference between these two cases, suggesting that people are ignoring the alternative cause in the causal direction. So my interpretation of this is that causal reasoning or predictive reasoning is actually a very natural thing. It's so natural that we ignore other causal pathways, other causal trajectories that we're not being asked about, and we simply focus on the one in front of us. But diagnostic reasoning, on the other hand, is not quite so natural. It's something that we have to set up and deliberate about, right, quite consciously. And when we do that, we make the right kind of judgment. So this failure to consider alternative causes, this neglect of alternative causes, has the following implication. So we have 2 groups of subjects in this study. The first one, this is a study that we ran during the midterm presidential election, or the midterm congressional elections in the US. And one group of people we gave the following two options to. I call this the marginal choice condition. We told people you get $10 no matter what happens, or you get $30 if the Republicans, as opposed to the Democrats, right, win control of the House of Representatives in the midterm elections. So it's a risky gamble. By the way, we're not as rich as this suggests, and we didn't actually give people $10 or $30. We told them they were going to participate in a lottery, and one of them would in fact win either $10 or $30, depending on their choice. So in that sense, it was a real choice they were making, okay? And what you see given this choice is that about 50% of the subjects chose the risky option of $30 if the Republicans win control. Another group is given exactly the same choice, the same pair of options, but before they make the choice, they're told the following. Recently, Ryan Frazier, a Republican candidate in Colorado's hotly contested 7th District House race, won the endorsement of the Denver Post, Colorado's largest newspaper. So this is clearly evidence in favor of the Republicans, right? And upon seeing this, you might say, well, the probability that the Republicans are going to take the House is slightly higher than it was before. But notice what happens when we tell people this. What happens is that now only 25% of them choose option 2. Now only 25% of them are willing to bet on the Republicans. So giving them positive evidence in favor of the Republicans reduced the probability that they would vote, that they expected the Republicans to win. Why? Well, this follows quite directly from our tendency to neglect alternative causes. When you're given this evidence, what that does, presumably, is block out the other reasons you might have had in mind for thinking that the Republicans would win. Now you have one causal trajectory in mind, and it's a very weak causal trajectory. So you neglect other causal trajectories and therefore are unwilling to bet. So what I've shown you so far is that causal structure is, well, I've argued that causal structure is central to reasoning, and that people do seem to represent causal systems coherently, even if it's not the causal system that the experimenter expects them to be representing. Second, I've shown you that diagnostic reasoning is, at least in the example I showed, normatively appropriate. People are reasoning in the way that Causal Bayes Nets say they should. But in the predictive or causal case, when people are reasoning forward, they neglect alternative causes, and that this can lead to what we've called the weak evidence effect. Okay. So far, some reasons to think that Causal Bayes nets serve as a good representation of how people reason causally, and more reason to think that there's something that the Causal Bayes net framework is missing. Let's think about the depth of people's understanding of causal systems. So this is a study by Rebecca Lawson at the University of Liverpool. And what she did was ask people to draw a bicycle. And in fact, if you ask people whether they can draw a bicycle, most people think, yeah, bicycles not only are common and not only are relatively simple, given the complex causal systems around us, but their mechanism is actually visible to us, right? Every time we encounter a bicycle, we see the mechanism by which it operates. So it should be easy to draw. And what happens when you ask people to draw a bicycle is that you get something like that, right? Which actually would not go very far because the chain is dissociated from the wheels. or that, which would not be too effective for a couple of reasons. One reason being that the petals have nothing to do with the chain. This one gets both the petals and chain wrong. This is one of my favorites. This is a great bike. It has the petals and chain in the right place, but it's kind of made for a chimpanzee. Actually, there's an artist, Gianluca Gimini. I don't know if he read Rebecca Lawson's paper, but he had his friends draw bicycles, and his friends are better artists than Rebecca Lawson's subjects. And then he built these 3D images of the bicycles. And you can see exactly the same thing, right? Like, this is a very cool bike. I'd love to own it, but if I got on it, I would fall over within a couple of seconds because it's impossible to turn, right? So people do not seem to have really good representations of even these relatively simple, visible causal systems. And this was demonstrated more rigorously in the lab by Leon Rosenblit and Frank Kyle, who took a bunch of common everyday objects like toilets and speedometers, sewing machines, ballpoint pens, and asked people to rate their degree of understanding of these objects on a 1 to 7 scale. And you can see that people rated their understanding as pretty good, right, at the midpoint of this scale. And then they asked people to explain how the objects work. Explain in as much detail as you can what the causal process is by which this object operates. And what they found was that people hemmed and hawed and weren't really able to generate explanations at all, so that when they later again asked them for a rating of their understanding, people themselves said the attempt to explain punctured this illusion I had that I understood, and so I'm going to rate my understanding as lower. Okay, so people themselves are admitting that they were living in what Rosenblit and Kyle call an illusion of explanatory depth, or we can think of it as an illusion of understanding. So this suggests a couple of things. One, it suggests that our representations of causal systems are relatively superficial. And it also suggests that we don't know that, right? Some colleagues and I showed this in the political domain. So we took a bunch of issues that were hot topics in the 2012 presidential election in the US, things like whether or not there should be a national flat tax or unilateral sanctions on Iran, which it turns out is still an issue. And we went through the Rosenblit and Kyle procedure of asking people their sense of understanding of these policies and how the policies produce outcomes. And then we asked them to explain them. And then again, we obtained ratings of understanding. And what we found was exactly the same thing that Rosenblit and Kyle did, that the attempt to explain showed people that they didn't understand as well as they thought they had. And so they gave lower judgments. And not only that, but in our case, we also asked people what their attitudes were towards the policies, whether they were supportive or not. And the attempt to explain actually reduced people's confidence in their own attitude. So it reduced their extremity. As a group, it reduced the polarization of the group with regard to these particular policies. I should say that the understanding effects have been replicated many times in various domains by different people. The effects on attitudes are smaller and not as consistent. And in fact, there's been at least one failure to replicate published, although we have an explanation for that and have our own replication of it. But the effect on hubris is certainly more controversial than the effect on understanding. One of our findings is that this effect is specific to causal explanation. So if instead of asking people to explain how the policy works in as much detail as you can, if you say to people, please give your reasons for whatever your attitude is towards the policy, reasons supportive or reasons against, then we didn't get the effect at all. So the effect seems specifically about causal explanation. And I'd be happy to talk about that in greater detail if anybody has questions about that. So the story so far is that people aren't storage devices, right? If you think about this thumb drive that you can buy on eBay or at Amazon for $10 or so, that thing can hold a few 100,000 copies of this book I wrote with Phil Fernbach called The Knowledge Illusion. According to Thomas Landauer, who was a famous cognitive scientist in the 80s and 90s, and unfortunately is now deceased, the capacity of the human brain for symbolic information is about 1 gigabyte. Right? So he did back of the envelope calculations using data from memory experiments. And he decided that the amount of information, of symbolic information we can retain is about 1/16 what this thumb drive can retain, or 1/300th of the laptop that you're probably watching this talk through. In other words, we're not made to store huge amounts of information. What we're made to do, I believe, is extract deeper principles like causal invariance that apply across situations and then identify them at the critical time. Okay, so the question arises, why do people experience this knowledge illusion, right? Why do we overestimate how well we understand things? And what I'd like to propose is that the reason we do that is because we fail to distinguish what other people know from what we know. Right? It's kind of the converse of the curse of knowledge, which some of you may be familiar with. So the curse of knowledge is the bane of all teachers. It's the fact that we tend to think that the people we're talking to know what we know. Right? If we're teaching math, then it's very hard to appreciate that our students do not understand things that we understand. After all, the only representation we have of their understanding is what's in our heads. Right? So the curse of knowledge is our tendency to attribute to other people knowledge that we have. The knowledge illusion is the tendency to attribute to ourselves knowledge that other people have. So in both cases, there's a failure to draw a clean separation between the knowledge in different people's heads. In other words, we think in terms of a community of knowledge. So I love this graphic that the German publishers of our book use to demonstrate this, right? This head that's composed of other people. Much of our thinking on this view actually takes place in the heads of other people. And this would explain why politics is so heated today, right? Because when we're defending our position, when we're defending our understanding of how the world works, we're not actually defending our own personal position, but rather we're defending the position of our team, of our community, of our family. And that's an emotional enterprise, right? We get our backup when we're defending our group more than when we're defending ourselves as individuals. This isn't a new idea. It's been around possibly for hundreds of years. A very famous and very well articulated expression of both the idea that people don't know as much as they think, and that the reason for this is because we rely on others for our thinking. We live in a community of knowledge, was expressed by Walter Lippmann, who's well known as a communication theorist, amongst other things, in 1922 in this book, Public Opinion, talking about propaganda used in World War I. Hilary Putnam, one of the great philosophers of last century, argued that meaning ain't in the head. He argued for what he called externalism. He was thinking about natural kind terms, but the idea was that when people refer to natural kind terms, so I might say, I hope one day to see a piece of molybdenum, and I can say that even though I have no idea what molybdenum is, right? But I can say it because I believe other people know what it is, and other people can identify reference of the word. So Putnam argued that more often than not, when we use natural kind terms, we're relying on other people to identify the reference of those terms. And we're arguing that, in fact, it's a much more general phenomenon than that, that when we're thinking about causal systems, we're relying on people all the time. Dan Wegner is famous for discussing transactive memory, which is the idea that memory systems belong to groups and that people divide up the effort required to remember things according to the expertise of group members. In fact, I think of the community of knowledge idea as a sort of an extension of what's sometimes called the extended mind, right? So central to cognitive science these days is the notion of embodiment, that we don't only use our brains to think, but we use our bodies and we use the world, right? So we use blackboards, for instance, and we use phones and we use Google, that those are fundamental intrinsic parts of the thinking process. All we're claiming is that we also use other people. And indeed, that's sort of that captures most of our thinking, right? Because as individuals, we're very narrow and specialized and relatively ignorant. So most of the understanding of the world that we make use of exists in other people's heads. And indeed, some of the early epistemologists thought about thinking this way, right? So according to some epistemologists, social epistemology, the idea that knowledge was contained within a community, came before the cognitive revolution, right? The idea that it's the individual that counts. And indeed, there's been a fair amount of work that I won't go into in psychology and cognitive science looking at these things. Please feel free to ask me about them afterwards if you're interested. Let me tell you briefly about a simple experiment I did on this with Marc-Louis Vives, who's currently a postdoc in our department at Brown. So in this study, we have two groups of people. The one group, I'll call them the red group, gets what's on the left there. They're told that a group of congressmen began drafting a bill to spend more money on highways. Policy researchers examined their plan, but they do not yet understand the impact it will have. Their current model has not been designed to explain this policy. And then the question we ask subjects is, how well do you understand the policy? And there's kind of a right answer here, right? The answer should be, I don't understand it at all, because you haven't told me anything about it. Another group of people are told exactly the same thing about the policy, but they're told that policy researchers fully understand it. Their financial model provides a full explanation of its effects. How well do you understand the policy? And again, there's a kind of right answer here. They shouldn't understand it. We haven't told them anything about it. And yet, people who are told that policy researchers do understand give higher ratings of their own understanding than people who are told that policy researchers don't understand. In other words, the sense of understanding is contagious, right? Learning that others, experts in this case, understand, increase people's sense of understanding. Okay, there are various control experiments that are necessary in order to justify what I just said, but I'm not going to tell you about them because I realize that I am way over time here. I will say that people are actually willing to put their money where their mouth is in this case, which I think takes care of some of the alternative explanations. And it turns out that people have to have access to the information. So if we tell them the explanation is secret, then we no longer get this bump in understanding. Okay, so the bottom line is that we get a sense of understanding from those around us as much as we do from our own reasoning processes. So you can imagine a case where I feel I understand because the people around me feel they understand, and those people feel they understand because the people around them feel they understand. And you see where this is going. There's a rich sense of understanding, not because anyone actually understands, but because the community as a whole feels like it understands. So ideology in this sense could be a house of cards. Or as Robert Armstrong said in the review of our book in the Financial Times, we imagine ourselves as rugged cognitive individualists growing our own intellectual food and living in mental houses built with our own hands. This is a dangerous error. And I think he's right. Okay, so I was going to talk about how we should think about causal representations, given everything I've just said. And so let me briefly just say that we do have to have some causal knowledge in common in order to communicate with one another, in order to have a basic understanding of what it takes to get around the world. So we might have this sort of coarse causal knowledge available, whereas the truth, it will be held by experts, right? And when I say experts, I'm trying to emphasize the plural. That is, you may have someone who knows about this and someone who knows about this and someone who knows about this, and the knowledge is actually held by the collective, right? And as those of us who are scientists know that there's necessarily this distribution of cognitive labor. So there are really interesting questions about how this kind of coarse representation might be related to this kind of deeper, more elaborated representation. And indeed, Samir is studying this in his dissertation. Okay, let me spend a few minutes talking about work by Babak, who I'm very thankful to say is here, so he can answer any hard questions you have about it. This talk is supposed to not only be about causal reasoning in humans, but also causal reasoning in machines. And that's something that Babak looked at in his dissertation. So this is work that he reported at a workshop on computational approaches to discourse. So the question that he addressed is, how do we actually make sense of the world in everyday life? And there's been a lot of recognition in cognitive science that narrative plays a really important role in that process. And the thing about narrative is that on any reasonable definition, it involves a coherent sequence of events and states controlled by characters, right, who do things at particular points in times, but they're causally and purposively related to the intentions of those characters. So the notion of causality, by all accounts that I've seen, is central to at least the vast majority of narratives. So Babak asked the question, whether we can see evidence for this in documents that humans generate and in documents that machines generate. So he had people annotate some documents for a variety of things, like whether they were narratives or something else, like arguments. And they narrated and they annotated those documents for linguistic features associated with narrativity or with argumentation style. So he had over 200 documents, and the topic was marijuana legalization. And the reason he chose marijuana legalization is because it's a topic in which we've seen a lot of change of opinion over the past 10 to 20 years. And so one thing that he will be looking at is how discourse changes as attitudes about issues change. Some of the documents were discussions on the social media site Reddit, where people were just discussing marijuana legalization. Some of them were news articles. And he sampled these things between the years 2008 and 2019. And then he looked at how well the different annotators of the documents agreed with one another, and their agreement was, well, it wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. It was good enough that I think we can draw some inferences. So here are some of the things that they annotated these documents for. Whether they included cause-effect relations, right? Whether they included other kinds of relations, like whether expectations were violated, whether there were conditional statements, if-then relations, similarity. So a variety of things. Also the temporal sequence, whether the temporal sequence of the events was explicitly marked. So I'm going through this quickly because I'm way over time, but hopefully you have a sense of the kinds of things that the annotators were looking at in these documents. So I'm gonna skip this and just make this point. So the other thing he did was have some text generating algorithms generate text. So he used massive neural networks, what are often called deep learning transformer networks that have dozens of layers. The first one he used is called Grover, which was state of the art when he started this work in 2019. It involves 1.5 billion parameters. But by the time he was not completing the work, but by the time he made a little bit of progress in 2020, there was another massive neural network around called GPT-3. This one had 175 billion parameters. So he did analyses with both of those. And the networks differ a little bit in their input. So Grover takes an entire human document as input, whereas GPT-3 takes just the first few sentences of a document. And their outputs, as a result, differ a little bit too. So Grover produces a completely new fake article, whereas GPT-3 just completes the prompt you gave it and builds a fake article from that. So here's an example of the kind of thing GPT-3 is able to generate. It said, so this is completely machine generated. It said, I've been there, I've smoked pot, I've hit a peak of smoking pot, I've come down from that peak and I've remained free from it. But mine could be considered an addiction, though it is certainly milder than an addiction to alcohol or heroin or cocaine. So I'm actually, whenever I see these things, I'm amazed by the coherence of the text that these machines are able to generate. But as I'm about to show you, it's not quite as coherent as you might want. Okay, so he took a bunch of documents and had them annotated in the same way he had the human docs annotated. I'm going to skip that and just jump right to the bottom line here, which is that up to a third of Grover relations are incoherent. So these are the different kinds of relations that people elaborated, that people annotated. And what we're plotting here is the proportion of them that are incoherent, that made no sense. So for instance, in the cause-effect case, you can see that approximately, that's this bar here, about a third of the relations were incoherent. So an example of an incoherent relation would be the baker decided to bake a cake for the couple, and that's why they were sued, right? So that just doesn't make sense to a normal human being. You should note that when humans generate these cause-effect relations, essentially none of them are incoherent. So the machine is not doing nearly as well as the human in terms of the coherence of its relations. And this, despite the fact that it's actually generating fewer of them. So here are the cause-effect relations, and you can see that humans generated on average, almost 3.5 per document, whereas the machine generate less than 2 on average. And that's true for most of the relations, except for the attribution one, which has to do with attributing a claim to an individual. So overall, Grover produces fewer semantic relations than humans, and it doesn't do that well. It actually does most poorly with cause-effect relations. And it turns out that GPT-3 doesn't do that much better. So this graph is comparing Grover to GPT-3, and you can see that actually for cause-effect relations, well, GPT-3 is getting fewer incoherent ones, right? So we're doing better over time, but there's still a lot more than humans would generate. And similarly, GPT-3 is producing far fewer cause-effect relations than humans do. Okay, so the takeaway is that even cutting-edge algorithms produce subhuman narratives and arguments, and maybe subhuman is not the best way to describe it. They're certainly producing fewer and less coherent ones. And we suspect, I agree with Babak, that the likely explanation for this is that language data is just not enough for human-like text generation, right? These algorithms, these machines are not considering the causal constraints that operate in the world. They're not even representing them. So how we do that is a really important question. In conclusion, causal Bayes nets capture some of the structure of human reasoning, but not all. Second, we live in an illusion of causal understanding, but we can induce humility through consequentialist discourse. That is, by asking people to explain how consequences arrive, we can induce a kind of humility. Deliberative thinking is a communal enterprise, right? We think together, both with the people around us, and we appeal to the larger culture to think all the time. And then finally, people are still better at representing causality than machines are. I'm really sorry I went so long over time, but I am now done.
Well, no, you are right on time, Steve, and thank you for this great and interesting talk. The floor is now open for questions. We have about 30 minutes for questions from the audience. If you like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand button and we'll give you the word. Or you can also write the question in the chat box and we will read it for you. And in fact, I think there are already a couple questions in the chat. One from Salma. Salma, would you like to start with your question?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's super interesting. Thanks a lot for the talk, first of all. It's mind-blowing. Some of the data is mind-blowing for me because I'm aware that it's unrealistic to think that we will have the knowledge of causal mechanisms of every event or process. So we use our heuristics whenever in the absence of causal mechanism knowledge. But when I listen the data from the weak evidence fallacy study and the previous study, it suggests that people tend to ignore alternative cause, even if they were giving an evidence, if my understanding is correct. So does that mean that particularly in political situations, people tend to not to learn or develop their ideas, but follow their beliefs instead? Do they close themselves to learning rather than learning? Do they just follow the existing beliefs, either imposed by the culture or by their family, sometimes friends, rather than.
Yeah, I think, so the way I would say it is, notice these studies aren't about learning, right? They're about causal inference. So I'm not going to say anything about causal learning because there are a lot of open questions about that. But it seems to me the important implication of the data is that the conversation gets dictated by the narrative that that whoever has started the conversation is using, right? So really the lesson is we're really susceptible to framing effects. So I always, whenever I watch the news, especially during an election season, I am shocked by the degree to which the news is governed by the narrative of the horse race of the election. So the idea is that there is this causal system, an election, right? And when you frame the current events in terms of that causal system, it sticks. That's the way people think about things, right? So I take the real lesson to be that if you give people some evidence, as you said, or frame things in any other way, then that frame is really going to determine how they think about it, because what we have trouble doing is removing ourselves from the perspective we've been put into and thinking about things from a different causal perspective. Does that help?
Yes, yes. It's super interesting to think about that, actually, because in political situations, causal mechanisms are quite complex and different. Because if you think about physical causality, for example, what causes a ball to move another, it's a little bit different. But in political and social context, I think there are so many parameters. And of course, in physical causality, there are invisible factors to be considered. But it's quite interesting, because if you introduce someone, what causes A to be happen in physical world, people may tend to learn or process or reason about the causes and effects. But in political situations, probably there are other different dynamics. It's quite complex, yeah. And it's very interesting.
So if you think about, Toby Gerstenberg has, this wonderful work where he asks people to make causal and counterfactual judgments about billiard balls hitting each other, right? And billiard balls going through gaps. And I actually suspect if you think about that example of physical causality, you would find exactly the same kind of effects. So people will happily attribute the movement of a billiard ball to another billiard ball hitting it, right? And say it went through the gap because it was hit by this other billiard ball. But of course, it also went through the gap because there was a gap there. And people are much less likely to consider that cause, right? They'll just assume the presence of the gap without sort of taking into account the counterfactual, the gap was absent. So I suspect this neglect of alternative causes is just as strong when we're thinking about physical causality as when we're thinking about other domains of causal systems. But it's an interesting question, and it'd be not obvious how to compare the two.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is another question in the chat. I believe it's from John Ho. Would you like to ask Steve your question, or I could also read it?
Yeah, I can just go ahead. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was super interesting. I just found all of the points that you raised really interesting, including your question, response to the earlier question. So I just thought, in general, in causal reasoning, there seems to be difference in how people process causal system that has like a multiple causes or one effect versus one cause that affects multiple effects. So just wondering if how could that be answered from a computational view, that like people seem to do much better in general, very roughly speaking, when there's a common effect model, a common cause model than a common effect model. That was just one question that popped up when I was listening. The other question that I had was really simple in the chat. I was just thinking about the community of knowledge piece that you were talking about, and thought if there's a situation where there's a in-group versus out-group distinction, people may not really feel overconfident about what they think an out-group member knows, because I think this has to do with this kind of sense of shared group identity that people have to kind of associate themselves with other people in the in-group, and they just consider what they know as what they their own knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so two very rich questions. Regarding the first one, I actually think the right way to think about how people distinguish common cause from common effect cases sort of follows directly from what we claimed about neglecting alternative causes, right? So the idea was the reason that people neglect alternative causes is because they build these mental simulations that take you from one state to another state. So that would be the common effect case, right? Because the first state might involve a lot of variables, and together they produce some effect. So we can think about that fairly effectively, although if there's a different causal trajectory that'll take us to the same effect, we will neglect that. But if you're thinking about the common effect case as a case of conjunction, right, where the variables are operating together to produce the effect, then that's a simulation. In contrast, if we're thinking from effect, a common cause model where we have a cause that leads to multiple effects, you're going to need multiple simulations in order to think about that in general, right? I mean, it depends on precisely what the effects are, but normally we think about the cause leading to one effect and the cause leading to the second effect and the cause leading to the third effect. And so that's going to be hard, and we're going to have to think about each effect separately. So I would predict, for instance, that it would take a lot more time to consider the probability of a set of effects given a single cause than it would be to consider the probability of a single effect given multiple causes. And in a sense, that has to be true, right? So with regard to your second question, I just have to, I'm looking at your chat so I can remind myself what it was. Difference between in-group versus, right. So we have done studies on out-groups. So this effect I described, this contagious sense of understanding effect, right? Turns out to be incredibly robust. So I've shown it multiple times in different cultures and with different kinds of materials. One study that I published with Nat Rab and John Hahn used Democrats and Republicans and used a variety of political issues like climate change and I think GMOs, genetically modified foods, and a few other things, immigration. And what we found was that we got this contagious sense of understanding effect. People's sense of understanding bumped up regardless of who the expert was, regardless of who it was that held the information. So, you know, even if it was a scientist, a climate change scientist who understood a phenomenon, Trump-loving Republicans would still get a little bump up in their sense of understanding of climate change. So notice that this is based on an implicit judgment of the degree to which you understand, right? In the sense that we're asking people to make an explicit judgment of understanding, but the fact that they're influenced by these experts' understanding is presumably implicit. If we ask them directly, do you trust scientists? Their ratings of trust were significantly lower than the Democrats. But nevertheless, when the scientists know it, they got the same bump in understanding. So I think it's important to distinguish whether this in-group versus out-group effect is being mediated by an explicit deliberative process, or whether it's a process that subjects aren't aware of. And it looks like you get the bump from the out-group even when subjects aren't aware. Yeah, a little bit of evidence for this is that when we put things in a raw political context, so we said, we're interested in people's political views. Now, the Republicans' minds didn't change when the scientists understood, right? So only if they thought we were trying to understand what people believed about climate change did their judgments change. But they didn't get this bump in understanding when they knew that we were interested in their political views, which presumably turned the information into something they could deliberate about more explicitly. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Armand, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the very nice talk. So my question is about, especially on the part that some people, right, preferring some causal explanation over the other. And so, I mean, I wanted to understand what do you think also about the size of the perceived causal model, right? Right, causal models are models and they have some certain size. I mean, you said that sometimes it's governed by the narrative when you were answering Selma's question. Right, we see a lot in the, for instance, political argumentations, political discussions, or certain propaganda, or take climate change and other things, right? Even if it's not the true causal model about what's happening, let's say a truly studied scientist explanation versus a layman on the street. So if somebody constructs a wrong causal model, but a very simple one, how does it play a role in the framing? And so are we more inclined to, I mean, provided that we have less information about the domain, are we more inclined to adopt the more simple explanations, or are we going for more complex ones? For instance, in science, we say, hey, if two theories are equally good in explaining some phenomena, right? We apply Occam's razor, for instance. Even there we go for something a simpler model. Does it also apply more generally in human behavior?
So there are a number of issues here. It's an interesting and complex question. So Tanya Lombroso, now at Princeton, has argued vociferously that yes, we do apply Occam's razor. Simplicity is the heart of the process by which we choose explanations. Unfortunately, I have some data which are wholly inconsistent with that. So we asked people to evaluate explanations of why Ronald Reagan got elected. And it turned out the more factors people included in their explanation, the better people considered the explanation, right? So the implication being that if you can give me 15 reasons that Ronald Reagan was elected, you're going to say that person really knows what they're talking about. They're giving a solid explanation as compared to someone who can only give 5 reasons. So, I think one of the issues here is that explanations have different purposes. Sometimes the explanation is there just to help us understand. And in that case, it's hard to believe that simplicity isn't critical. But sometimes the explanation is supposed to be more informational. Like when a journalist provides an explanation for an event, they have to not only provide something simple and understandable, there has to be a kind of thoroughness to their account, right? And one would hope the same would be true of a scientist. So the more factors you bring in, the more evidence you're providing that you really know what you're talking about. So that's one set of considerations. Another is that sometimes we want an explanation so simple that it doesn't even exist. So Babak's first-year project involved showing people explanations that were completely circular and asking them if they thought they were good explanations. And the answer was they were good explanations if and only if they were used phrases that were entrenched in the community, right? So this is an example of what we call outsourcing, right? So because we're limited as individuals and want to appeal to the communities around us, we will outsource our explanations. And if I can say that, this person is behaving this way because they're schizophrenic, even though I have no idea what schizophrenic means, and even though there's not really a good answer to the question, what does schizophrenic mean, people will appeal to the term because it's a term that's entrenched in the community. And in fact, one thing that Babak has shown is that they'll do that, even clinical psychologists will do that, right? They'll appeal to explanations of behavior, of pathological behavior that are completely circular as long as those explanations are entrenched in the community. So it's sort of the ultimate simplicity, right? You're outsourcing the problem to someone else. So that's a complex answer to a simple question, sorry.
No, thanks. It was, and if I may, just a very, very quick. So, and it might be, so many reasons for one single event, right? But they are all connected parallelly to some certain cause. But it might be different if it's a chain, right? As a single chain that if I explain you why a theoretical result follows, right, a mathematical theorem, it takes maybe 15 steps, and right, I mean, even for a scientific mind, it's really hard to follow. And do you see what I'm getting at? It's a one long
Sure.
pipeline.
No, so simplicity is going to be a very powerful cue to what makes something understandable. No. I mean, the thing about simplicity is that it's sort of defined by being understandable, right? So I agree with you, but I do worry that the account that appeals to simplicity is circular, right? Because that which is simple is that which you can understand. And if our goal is to understand, then by definition, we want simpler explanations.
Thanks.
I do have a couple questions myself. The first one, so Steve, and please correct me if I'm wrong. In your response to John-Ho, where you were talking about the illusion of understanding is still seen when the experts are in your out group.
No, the contagious sense of understanding is still
yeah,
seen. It's a different effect, right?
Yes. So that effect is still seen when the experts are in the out group. And if I recall correctly, you also have at least some evidence that the same effect is lowered if you believe that this information is not accessible. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So I skipped that experiment. I was intending to show that experiment.
Right. So what I am curious is that wouldn't those two findings contradict each other, in the sense that if you assume the knowledge is known in your outgroup, in an outgroup experts, you would also probably assume that this knowledge is not accessible to you because they are in the outgroup. So wouldn't that?
Sorry, yeah, I'm not really seeing that, Samir. I mean, the way we ran the Republican Democrat experiment is we said scientists understand this process having to do with climate change. How well do you understand this process having to do with climate change? And I actually think in that case, it's Democrats have no more access to the scientific explanation than Republicans do, right? Like all of these explanations are in the public domain. So I don't think there's an access issue there. In our study in which we did manipulate access, what we said was the explanation is being kept secret by the Defense Research Agency, right? So nobody can access it. So I think both of those findings are perfectly consistent with one another on the assumption that anybody has access to the explanations that scientists have access to.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. The other question that I have is that in the first part of your talk, you mentioned briefly that people tend to prefer mechanistic information over probabilistic ones, right? And I'm curious if this is because people have a very deterministic notion of how the world works, and they believe that probabilistic information is simply a placeholder for more complicated mechanistic information that is the real cause of whatever happening is in the world. And because of that, mechanistic information by definition is seen more informative than the probabilistic ones, because they are the actual reasons for what's happening that is also underlying the probability.
I guess that's possible. I think about these things the way Judea-Pearl does. So what Pearl suggests is that systems become more probabilistic the more you abstract from them, right? So the less you know, or the less you consider, the more probabilistic something is. So you could have, say, like if I say smoking causes cancer, that's clearly probabilistic in the sense that smoking doesn't always cause cancer. And if I say smoking causes cancer by depositing tar in the lungs, then that's now a mechanistic explanation. But it's not deterministic, right? Because it all depends on how much tar is deposited in the lungs. And there may be some people for whom no tar is deposited, or the tar is removed, or the tar doesn't cause cancer. So what makes something deterministic in my mind is when the mechanism is specified so completely that there's no probability left, right? You know exactly what's going on at every step. So given that you can have highly probable abstract mechanisms and very detailed mechanisms that have very little probability, in the sense that the probabilities are all either 0 or 1 or close to it, it seems to me that both of those things kind of move together. And it doesn't feel like the appeal to determinism explains the preference for mechanism.
Yeah, yeah, this is something that I would probably like to think about, because you especially made a good point about how the mechanisms can also themselves be abstract and more detailed, and you can still have abstract mechanisms that are probabilistic.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I see that
There-
Matt has a question.
yeah, please, you can unmute yourself, Matt.
Thanks for the lovely talk, Stephen. It's really interesting. I have a question about how you saw that difference in effect between asking people to explain how something works and asking people for their reasons. And you didn't, and you see, I think you saw a drop in confidence in people's reporting of their knowledge of how it works if they're asked to explain how it works compared to their reasons. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about what kind of reasons people were giving. Was it that they weren't giving causal reasons, and was there much?
No, that's exactly. They were certainly not giving causal reasons. Look,
Right.
you know, I have ended many conversations at cocktail parties by giving causal reasons, right? Because that's not what people want to talk about. What people want to talk about is their preferences and who they know and what the people around them think, right? What they like and what they don't like. What they don't want to do generally, except for, you know, us strange academics, is to really unpack exactly the process by which things work. It's not only academics, engineers sometimes like to do this too, right? So the way I think about that effect is you ask people to give a causal explanation of something and they can't do it, so they realize they don't understand it as well, and their confidence in their attitude becomes lower. But if you ask people to give reasons, what they do is they talk about who else believes this, and they provide anecdotes about situations in which they've encountered this policy. And they don't come away with this feeling they don't understand. In fact, they come away with this feeling like they're closer to the policy because they've now thought about it. We were actually expecting judgments to increase when people generate reasons. So that's one way to think about it. Here's another way to think about it that I think is probably more important and closer to the truth. That when you're thinking about something causally, you're thinking about it independent of yourself, independently of your identity, right? Like if I ask you how a bicycle works, you're not thinking about your relation to bicycles, you're thinking about bicycles on their own. Whereas if I ask you what your reasons are for liking bicycles or having a bicycle, you're thinking about yourself and your own relation to the bicycle. And that's what people do generally, right? That's what dinner time conversation is like. So I think the trick, if you want to turn down the temperature in political discussion or in any kind of discussion, is to make the discussion not about the individual, but about the object being discussed, right? I mean, that's the trick, like with teaching. If you're going to criticize a student, don't criticize the student, criticize the student's ideas. So it's not personal. And I think it's that lack of what's the word I'm looking for here? You know, involvement of the person that is the critical element here.
So if I could just ask a little bit about that, is there, I mean, it's interesting if you look on somewhere like Twitter and you just see groups of people sharing the same beliefs, and it's highly like, I mean, it's not uncommon to bump into people as soon as you start asking their knowledge about a particular concept that turns out they don't know, but they have a very strong belief in this. And there was a documentary that showed over here recently about QAnon, you know, this amazing kind of fascinating phenomena going around these events that were kind of, it's like they were presenting it kind of like a religion, and they had these like 10 commandments, and it's like in this house we believe that President Trump was robbed of this, and like just stated very explicitly like that. And connected to what you were talking about then about, asking people, what are your reasons? And I guess if people were quite explicit, they might say, well, because this is what my group believes and I want to be part of my group. So I was wondering, is there a kind of functional role in having shared knowledge in terms of the group membership and social membership?
Well, it makes conversation possible, right? I mean, we couldn't, think about the prerequisites for us to be talking right now. So obviously we have to have a language in common, but we also have to have knowledge of the current political environment in common in order to talk about QAnon, right? Like you assumed that I knew who Donald Trump was, which, unfortunately is a fair assumption, but you're making assumptions like that all the time. So we have to have a lot of common ground in order to have a conversation. Of course, part of that common ground has to include certain sort of like principles of rationality. Like if I say A, therefore B, then you have to assume that I have some understanding of logic, or else you wouldn't be able to make sense of my claim, A, therefore B. So yeah, we have to have some commonality. But the point of my talk is there's also a division of cognitive labor, right? Such that like you're a developmental psychologist and I'm not. So I assume you know a lot more about developmental methodology than I'll ever know. And if I'm reviewing a paper on developmental psychology, I might ask you, right, as the expert. So in that sense, I have my expertise and you have your expertise, and that's not in common. And that's what enriches our community, by having that huge pool of knowledge. But we still have to have some superficial commonality just in order to know where to look for the knowledge, for one, right? Frank Kyle's done a lot of work on that.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Sure.
Well, I think we are just run out of time. Thank you, Steve, again, for a very interesting talk, and thanks everyone for joining us on this very interesting Q&A session.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Steve. It was very interesting. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Selma. Talk to you soon, I hope.